11 fire engines sat frozen at a locked steel gate, while an $8 million clubhouse burned on the other side. The gate belonged to the homeowners association. The road belonged to Silas Redford. He had warned them 3 times this exact night would come, and every single time they laughed him out of the room. Now the fire had no mercy, the gate had no power, the guard had abandoned his post, and firefighters stood helpless behind steel. They couldn't cut through fast enough. Somewhere on that mountain, a woman who once bragged about controlling every inch of her community was about to learn exactly what her $25 toll had really cost her. Stay until the end to see how one gate turned an empire of rules and fees into evidence at trial. Silas Redford owned more than 1,100 acres behind Cedar Summit Estates, land thick with old-growth pine, dry ravines and slopes, so steep that a single spark in August could turn the whole hillside into a furnace by nightfall. Before he ever became a rancher, Silas spent nearly 2 decades as a wildfire engineer for the Forest Service, studying how flames traveled across dry terrain, how wind funneled through canyons, and how minutes, not hours, decided whether a community survived or burned to its foundation. He carried that knowledge home with him when he finally settled the land his grandfather had first cleared, and it shaped nearly every decision he ever made about that mountain, especially the one road running through it. 18 years earlier, he and the county had carved a wide dirt road along the edge of his property, a road built for exactly one purpose: to let fire trucks, ambulances, and forestry crews reach the hillside community above him before a small fire became an unstoppable one. It was never a public road. Silas had simply signed an agreement granting free passage to any emergency vehicle that needed it. No fee, no gate, no conditions. Because in his mind, a road built to save lives should never come with a price tag attached. That road cut the response time to Cedar Summit from nearly 30 minutes down to under 10, and it was the only route with turns wide enough for a ladder truck or a loaded water tanker to navigate safely. For nearly 2 decades, Silas graded the surface himself, cleared dead brush along the shoulders, dug drainage channels before every rainy season, and inspected the load-bearing culverts without ever asking the association for a dime. Cedar Summit had been a modest cluster of homes when he first built the road. It grew fast once Colette Farnsworth took over as association president, expanding into sprawling estates, a private tennis complex, a spa, and eventually a clubhouse worth $8 million perched right at the top of a hill called Ridgeview, in a spot with the highest wildfire exposure in the entire district. Silas first met Colette at a county fire safety meeting, the kind most residents skip but where the details actually mattered. When the district fire captain, a steady man named Abram Lockwood, reminded the room that Silas Redford's fire road had to remain clear at all times, Colette bristled visibly. She argued that a road running so close to her community, one she didn't control, was a liability to property values, an eyesore the association should be managing directly. Silas told her plainly that the road wasn't built to raise home prices. It was built so a fire truck could arrive before a house turned to ash. And Colette smiled the thin, practiced smile of someone who had already decided the conversation was over. She answered that Cedar Summit had its own security, its own sprinkler systems, and a fire budget larger than any ranch in the county could dream of. From that very first exchange, Silas understood something important. Colette didn't see the road as a lifeline. She saw it as unclaimed territory, a stretch of land sitting just outside her authority, and authority was the one thing Colette Farnsworth could never tolerate leaving unclaimed. Under her leadership, Cedar Summit had transformed from a quiet handful of ranch-style houses into a gated showcase of wealth, with new streets named after imported trees and a marketing brochure that promised buyers, quote, total control over their surroundings, a phrase Colette herself had personally approved. Neighbors who had lived there for years began to notice how every decision, no matter how small, seemed to route back through her office, from the color of mailboxes to the hours the pool stayed open, and few of them dared to challenge it out loud. A week later, red survey stakes appeared on both sides of the fire road, each one stamped with the same 6 words that would define the next year of Silas Redford's life: proposed site, Cedar Summit Checkpoint Station. Silas called the association office and demanded all surveying stop immediately, but Colette never picked up the phone. Instead, she sent a formal letter, one that reframed his private fire road as, in her words, a shared commercial corridor, simply because emergency vehicles used it. The letter claimed the association had every right to manage traffic flow across the route to protect residents, and it laid out 3 demands: that Silas surrender control of the eastern gate, that outside vehicles register in advance, and that anyone crossing pay a maintenance toll. Silas forwarded the letter straight to his attorney, a sharp, unflappable woman named Ruth Ellington, who confirmed in minutes what he already suspected. The association held no ownership, no easement, and absolutely no legal standing to charge a toll on private land that wasn't theirs. Ruth sent a cease and desist. Captain Lockwood sent his own warning separately, stating that any obstruction placed on that route could violate county fire access codes outright. Colette ignored both. Instead, she called an emergency association meeting and presented the road to residents as a, quote, serious security gap, describing an outside threat that could slip through and enter the neighborhood, despite no such incident ever having occurred in 18 years. To win support, she promised the checkpoint would never slow emergency crews, that it would use an electronic code system license plate recognition and an automatic emergency override, and the board approved a budget of $185,080 on the spot. A contractor named Travis Garrison was hired to install a double steel gate, a guard cabin, and an automated spike strip at the narrowest stretch of the entire route, all wired to draw power from the clubhouse itself rather than any independent source. Dwayne Calder, the association's security manager, was assigned to run the tolls $25 for service vehicles, $75 for trucks, $250 for anything commercial and heavy. Silas arrived on site while concrete was still being poured and showed Travis the county property maps, proving the land belonged to him and not the association, and Travis, visibly uneasy, admitted Colette had told him otherwise. Colette showed up minutes later with Dwayne and 2 security staff, declaring that the association had every right to protect the community from what she called uncooperative landowners. Silas warned her directly in front of witnesses that she was building an obstruction on the one road fire crews depended on, and that when disaster came, the gate wouldn't care whether she was president of anything. Colette's answer was cold and dismissive, that Cedar Summit didn't need a rancher lecturing them on how to protect their own property. 3 days later, Silas woke up to find his own fire road sealed shut behind a brand new steel gate he had never agreed to. Silas drove down to the gate and asked Dwayne to open it, and Dwayne simply pointed to the posted rate sign and asked for $25. Silas reminded him calmly that the cabin, the gate, and the entire checkpoint were sitting on his own land, and Dwayne answered that he was only following association policy, adding that any attempt to force the gate would trigger the spike, strip, and bring security, possibly the police. Silas didn't argue further. He photographed everything, logged the GPS coordinates, and called Ruth, who filed for a temporary restraining order that same afternoon, only for the first hearing to be delayed when the association's attorneys requested extra time to respond. While the case sat waiting, the checkpoint began creating real problems. Almost daily forestry vehicles held up for license verification. Water trucks turned away because drivers didn't carry cash. A road maintenance crew billed $250 out of nowhere, and during one routine emergency drill, a rescue team lost nearly 6 minutes waiting for Dwayne to locate the correct access code. A veterinarian responding to a livestock emergency on a neighboring property was turned back entirely one afternoon because her truck wasn't registered with the association, forcing her to take a 40-minute detour around the tasked mountain while an injured animal waited. Word of these incidents spread quickly through the county's small emergency services community, and more than one dispatcher began quietly flagging. Cedar Summit calls for extra response time just in case. Abram staged an unannounced inspection of his own driving, a fire engine straight to the gate, with lights flashing, only to find the plate recognition camera useless because dust had coated the lens, forcing Dwayne to call Colette for the plate recognition camera useless. Manual code while she sat inside a clubhouse party and let the call go unanswered for over 7 minutes. Abram filed a formal violation and demanded the gate remain open until an independent emergency override was installed, and Colette complied only for the day of the inspection, locking it again that same night. She went further, ordering Travis to replace the mechanical lock with a fully electronic bolt housed inside a reinforced steel box, one that firefighters could no longer cut through with standard tools in an emergency. Meanwhile, Miriam Rockwell, the association's accountant, discovered Colette had funded the entire checkpoint using money drawn from the fire safety reserve, despite the project having no permit and no legitimate connection to fire safety at all. Miriam emailed Brett Winslow, the board's finance officer, warning that the insurer could deny future claims if the gate was ever shown to have delayed emergency response, and Brett forwarded the warning directly to Colette. Her reply was a single line that no fire had ever started simply because of a gate, a sentence that would later be read aloud in a courtroom as proof of exactly how much she already understood and chose to dismiss. Silas installed his own cameras across from the checkpoint, quietly documenting every single time an emergency vehicle was slowed or stopped, and sent Colette one final written warning, complete with fire risk maps, wind pattern data, and a list of 6 wildfires that had struck within 30 miles over the past decade. Colette never answered him personally. Instead, the association fined him $1,000 for, in their words, installing surveillance equipment that violated resident privacy, despite Silas never having been a member of the association in the first place. He looked at the worthless invoice and told Ruth that these people clearly weren't afraid of the law, that maybe the only thing capable of reaching them was consequence itself delivered the hard way. By late August, the weather turned into exactly the kind of danger every fire captain in the county had spent months, warning residents about humidity dropping fast, southwest winds picking up strength, and the brush around Ridgeview Hill dried out until it crackled underfoot like paper. The county issued a burn restriction, banning fireworks, open flames, and any spark-producing equipment at outdoor gatherings, and Abram personally circulated the notice to every community in the district, Cedar Summit included. Cedar Summit was at that exact moment finalizing plans for its 10-year clubhouse anniversary, a lavish evening meant to showcase Colette's vision to investors, brokers, and local officials, complete with string lighting, gas heaters, and a stage wired for a full sound system. Colette had spent nearly 4 months planning the event, personally choosing the caterer, the guest list, and even the color of the linens herself, treating the anniversary as proof that Cedar Summit had become exactly the kind of exclusive destination she had always promised her buyers. She brushed off 2 separate suggestions from her own events coordinator to scale back the outdoor lighting given the dry conditions, insisting the display was the entire point of the evening. The event contractor flagged a backup generator with a visible fuel leak, and Colette's response was to hide it behind a decorative wall panel rather than replace it. Travis separately discovered that the clubhouse and the toll gate shared the exact same power distribution board, meaning that if the clubhouse ever lost power, the gate would automatically lock itself to prevent unauthorized entry, a fail-safe designed for security that would soon become a fail-safe for disaster. He recommended switching the gate to fail-open during any power outage, and Colette refused, outright worried that outsiders might exploit a blackout to slip through without paying, and she ordered the lockdown setting kept exactly as it was, an instruction Miriam quietly saved to a personal filet. That same afternoon, Silas noticed dust clouds rolling along the ridgeline and felt the wind shift direction, a change that meant something to a man who had spent years fighting wildfires professionally. He called Abram to ask whether Cedar Summit had cleared its defensible space around the clubhouse, and Abram confirmed the association had skipped 2 required inspections in a row. Driving down to check his own stretch of road, Silas found Dwayne installing decorative concrete blocks meant to stop vehicles from bypassing the guard cabin, entirely blocks that would also make it impossible for a fire truck to steer around a failed gate if the electronics ever went down. By nightfall, hundreds of string lights glowed across the clubhouse grounds, while the association flag snapped hard in a wind strong enough to worry anyone paying attention. Around 9:17 that evening, a server near the stage caught the smell of burning plastic moments before an overloaded circuit threw a spark into the decorative wall panel, hiding the leaking generator, and the first flame appeared, no taller than a hand. Staff reached for the nearest fire extinguisher only to find it past its inspection date, and by the time a working one was located, the fire had already crawled across the fabric drapery and caught the wooden eave above the stage. A second server tried beating the flames back with a tablecloth, buying perhaps 30 seconds before the fabric caught as well, and by then the fire had already found the dry cedar shingles lining the overhang, climbing faster than anyone standing on that patio could process. Guests near the stage began backing away, some laughing nervously at first, assuming the display was somehow part of the anniversary celebration, until the smoke thickened enough that laughter turned to shouting. The building's alarm triggered, but the water pump failed to engage because the electrical board had already shorted out, and at 9:21, a guest placed the first call to emergency services. Seconds later, the clubhouse lost power entirely, and more than a mile down the mountain, the toll gate's mechanism let out a heavy metallic click, as both steel doors locked themselves shut, exactly as programmed, exactly as Colette had insisted. At the fire station, Abram Lockwood received the call. A major structure fire at Cedar Summit with a real risk of spreading into surrounding forest, and within minutes he had 11 engines rolling. The convoy was substantial: 4 standard engines, 3 water tankers, 2 heavy rescue trucks, 1 ladder truck, and a command vehicle, all moving in formation along Redford Fire Access Road, with Abram in the lead watching black smoke rise over Ridgeview Hill from miles away. By every calculation, they were roughly 9 minutes from the clubhouse. When the convoy reached the checkpoint, the steel gate sat closed and dark, the guard cabin empty because Dwayne had left his post to attend the party he was supposed to be securing. Abram punched in the emergency access code the association had provided months earlier, but the control panel showed no power at all. He tried the mechanical backup only to discover it had been swapped for the reinforced electronic bolt. Colette had ordered installed a lock no standard cutting tool could reach in time. Firefighters attacked the gate with rescue saws, throwing sparks but failing to cut through the thick steel hinges, and a heavy rescue truck attempted to force the gate open, only for the flanking concrete blocks to prevent the driver from getting a workable angle without risking damage to the steering system and blocking the entire line behind him. The road was too narrow for any vehicle to turn around, leaving all 11 engines trapped in a single motionless column. While the fire above them grew, engine crews standing at the fence line watching orange light spread across the ridge, with nothing to do but wait for a gate that refused to open. One young firefighter, barely 2 years on the job, kept asking his captain how a private community could possibly be allowed to lock a road like this, and nobody had an answer that made the wait feel any shorter. Abram radioed Colette directly through dispatch, and she was standing outside the burning clubhouse, screaming that the crews should simply use the access code to get through. Abram told her flatly that the gate had no power, exactly as he had warned her it might one day. Colette ordered Travis to trigger the remote override, and Travis explained almost helplessly that the control system sat inside the clubhouse's technical room, the same room currently engulfed in the worst of the fire. Silas heard the sirens from his ranch and pulled up his own camera feed to find the entire convoy stopped dead at his gate. He drove his heavy tractor down but resisted the urge to simply rip the gate apart, knowing the buried concrete anchors and underground wiring could flip the machine or injure a firefighter if pulled the wrong way. Instead, he handed Abram a map of an old secondary route through a northern ravine, unsuitable for the ladder truck or the tankers, but passable for a smaller rescue vehicle carrying hand tools. Abram sent 2 teams that way immediately, while continuing the fight to break through the main gate, and above them the fire jumped past the clubhouse roof and into the surrounding pines, pushed by wind straight toward the nearest row of estates. Cedar Summit's own sprinkler system lost pressure entirely, and the decorative water feature nearby had no fitting compatible with a fire hose. After 19 minutes, one of Silas's own tow trucks arrived and he chained it to the right-hand support post while firefighters cut through the weakened crossbar, finally tearing the post from the ground and dropping one side of the gate flat. The opening still wasn't wide enough for the ladder truck, costing another 6 minutes to drag the guard cabin clear of the roadway, bringing the total delay to 27 minutes and 14 seconds before the first fire engine finally crossed the threshold, arriving just as the fire engine clubhouse's main roof collapsed in on itself. Abram looked at the clock on his dashboard and said quietly that they hadn't arrived late because of distance, they had arrived late because someone had locked the road. By the time crews reached Ridgeview Hill, the clubhouse was fully engulfed, the roof collapsed, sending embers across the parking structure and landscaped grounds, and Abram split his remaining forces into 3 groups: 1, to protect the nearest homes, 1, to secure a propane tank behind the clubhouse, and 1 to cut a containment line along the forest edge. With 27 minutes already lost, saving the clubhouse itself was no longer realistic. The only remaining goal was stopping the disaster from spreading further into the community and the surrounding woodland. Silas brought his bulldozer onto his own land to carve a containment line, and his years of professional firefighting experience helped the crews read the wind and anticipate where the flames would jump next. The propane tank eventually ruptured, shattering every western-facing window and giving Colette a front-row view of her symbol of power, reduced to a smoking steel frame. She tried immediately to blame the delay on the fire department, confronting Abram in front of witnesses and demanding to know why 11 engines had been sitting at the bottom of the hill for so long, and Abram simply pointed toward the torn-open gate and said, "Because of your checkpoint." Colette pivoted instantly, accusing Silas of sabotaging the gate mechanism, suggesting his cameras might have interfered with the electronics somehow, an accusation Silas didn't even bother arguing against, noting only that 3 separate camera angles had captured the entire sequence, including the exact moment the gate locked itself, the second the clubhouse lost power. By early morning, the fire was contained, the clubhouse a total loss, 2 additional structures badly damaged, 14 vehicles destroyed in the parking area, and more than 70 acres of surrounding forest affected. Every guest at the event was an adult, and all were evacuated safely, though several were treated on scene for smoke inhalation, and initial damage estimates climbed past $12 million almost immediately. The real trouble began when the insurance company sent its own investigators, demanding permits for the gate certification for the emergency override system, inspection records for the fire road maintenance logs for the alarm system, and documentation of how the association had responded to prior county warnings. Colette had none of it in order. She called an emergency board meeting and pressured the remaining members to describe the gate publicly as a temporary security measure, a framing Brett immediately challenged, pointing to meeting minutes where Colette herself had called it permanent and had personally ordered the lockdown setting kept active during outages. Colette threatened to fire Miriam and tried to pin the entire disaster on Travis alone, but Miriam had already quietly backed up every relevant email, invoice, and meeting transcript onto a personal drive of her own, a habit she had developed years earlier after watching Colette rewrite meeting minutes to erase inconvenient objections. Brett, for his part, began keeping his own written record, 2 forwarding copies of every controversial decision to a private account, uneasy about what history might eventually ask of him. That same day, the state fire office sealed off the clubhouse ruins, and Special Investigator Vaughn Beckett announced publicly that this was no longer being treated as a simple construction accident. Standing among the wreckage, Vaughn held up copies of the 3 written warnings Colette had personally received and asked her directly why she had kept the road locked after being repeatedly told it could block emergency vehicles. And for the first time since the fire started, Colette Farnsworth had no answer at all. Vaughn pulled data from the dispatch center, the dashboard cameras of all 11 engines, and Silas's own surveillance footage, reconstructing the timeline down to the second. The first emergency call at 9:21, the power failure at 9:23, the automatic lockdown at 9:24, the first engine reaching the gate at 9:29, the roadway finally cleared at 9:56, and the main roof fully collapsing at 10:02. The data proved the fire crews had responded exactly by the book, and that every second of delay had happened entirely at the checkpoint itself, nowhere else along the route. Colette still tried to twist the narrative, sending residents a notice claiming Silas had refused to let the association upgrade the road and had deliberately manufactured a land dispute to punish Cedar Summit. And Ruth answered with 18 years of maintenance records paid entirely out of Silas's own pocket, along with the original rescue access agreement, proving he had always allowed emergency vehicles to pass free of charge. Miriam then reached out to Vaughn directly, handing over internal emails, 3 of which were particularly damning. One from Travis, warning that the gate needed to fail open during power loss. One from Brett, warning that insurance could reject the claim entirely, and one written by Colette herself instructing staff to keep the lockdown. Setting active, stating she would rather force firefighters to call in for a code than let anyone cross for free. Vaughn also uncovered that Colette had spent $185,000 from the Fire Safety Reserve to build the checkpoint without disclosing its true purpose to residents, and a separate invoice for $32,000 covered, reinforcing the lockbox. Specifically, after Abrams' inspection described in writing as preventing unauthorized access using cutting tools, proof that Colette hadn't just known the gate endangered fire crews. She had actively made it harder to force open. Travis agreed to cooperate, fully producing messages in which Colette rejected the manual override feature, entirely calling it, quote, too easy to exploit, and Dwayne admitted he had once suggested storing a spare mechanical key inside a standard fire department lockbox, an idea Colette shut down out of fear that Silas himself might use it to move his own vehicles through for free. Vaughn's team also interviewed 3 residents who had complained to the board months earlier about the checkpoint's unreliability, none of whom had ever received a written response. And each of those complaints, once entered into evidence, painted the same picture: a pattern of warnings, raised and ignored, repeated so consistently that no jury would later be able to call it an accident. The insurance company suspended a significant portion of its payout, suspecting the association had deliberately concealed a known and previously flagged danger. Residents of Cedar Summit began turning on Colette almost overnight, facing the possibility of special assessments running into tens of thousands of dollars per household if the claim was denied outright, and a group of longtime homeowners who had rarely spoken up at meetings before began organizing petitions demanding a full, independent audit of every decision Colette had made over the past 3 years, not just the checkpoint. During a chaotic board meeting, Colette tried spreading blame across Brett, Miriam, Travis, Dwayne, and Silas all at once, but Silas simply arrived with Ruth at his side, saying nothing, letting Ruth hand each board member a copy of a new lawsuit, naming trespass, obstruction of legal land use, destruction of the fire road, damage to drainage systems, the cost of using his own equipment to break the gate, and the ongoing wildfire risk his 1,100 acres had been exposed to as a direct result. Before leaving the room, Ruth turned back and said the clubhouse wasn't the only thing that gate was about to cost the association. Colette hired a crisis communications firm and a new legal team, building a strategy meant to paint Silas as a man with a grudge, pointing to his past objections to the clubhouse, his cameras aimed at the checkpoint, and his presence near the scene the night of the fire, and her attorneys demanded access to his devices, his phone records, and his footage in an attempt to prove some kind of hidden motive. Silas handed everything over voluntarily, and it backfired completely. His cameras placed him at his own barn when the fire started, and his vehicle's GPS confirmed he only arrived at the gate after hearing the sirens himself. Colette's crisis firm even drafted a press statement suggesting Silas had a documented history of, quote, hostility toward community progress, citing his objections to the original clubhouse permits years earlier. But when reporters actually reviewed those old public records, they found Silas's objections had focused entirely on fire clearance requirements, not on the building itself, undercutting the entire narrative before it ever gained traction. The official fire investigation determined the cause was a combination of an overloaded circuit, flammable decorative material, and fuel leaking from the hidden generator with absolutely no evidence of sabotage anywhere in the record. Instead, investigators found the clubhouse had failed 3 mandatory safety requirements outright: an expired fire extinguisher, an unmaintained emergency water pump, and dry brush around the structure that had never been properly cleared. All items Colette had personally signed off on, as completed, in order to let the anniversary event proceed as planned. That signature alone exposed her to charges of falsifying a safety, filing a discovery that changed the entire tone of the case overnight. Ruth asked the court to order the checkpoint removed entirely, and the association fought back, insisting the gate itself represented hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal property. Judge Corrine Alder looked over the property survey and asked the association's attorney a simple question: exactly how many square feet of land did the association actually own beneath that structure? And the honest answer turned out to be none at all. The court confirmed the entire checkpoint sat squarely on Silas Redford's private property, and when Colette tried arguing the association held some kind of customary right of use, Ruth countered that an emergency passage agreement never created a right to build a commercial toll station or charge the landowner himself to cross his own ground. The judge ordered the checkpoint removed within 72 hours, the association to cover every cost of restoring the roadway, no obstruction of any kind ever placed on the fire route again, and Silas granted the right to personally oversee the removal process. While the crew dismantled the gate, they discovered its foundation had ruptured an underground drainage pipe, causing erosion beneath the roadbed that added another $400,000 to the total restoration cost. That same day, Vaughn forwarded his full investigative file to the county prosecutor's office, recommending charges related to obstructing emergency response, falsifying safety certifications, misusing association funds, deliberately concealing a known hazard, and interfering with a designated fire access route. As the gate was finally lifted from the ground, a deputy stepped forward and handed Colette Farnsworth her formal summons. The civil trial went first, the courtroom packed with Cedar Summit residents, reporters, and representatives from the insurance company, all watching as the association's attorneys tried to frame the checkpoint as nothing more than an administrative mistake, arguing that Colette couldn't have predicted a rare convergence of fire, power, failure, and a locked gate happening all at once. Ruth methodically proved that this exact convergence was precisely what had been warned about again and again in writing. Abram testified about the inspection that had trapped his own engine for 7 minutes and 42 seconds, confirming he had formally requested the gate remain open until a truly independent backup system existed. Travis walked the jury through the original engineering plans, which called for the gate to fail open automatically during a power outage, alongside a revision bearing Colette's own signature, ordering it changed to fail locked. Instead, Miriam read aloud the email in which Colette said she would rather force firefighters to request a code than let anyone pass without paying. And Dwayne admitted under oath that he had no mechanical key available the night of the fire, because Colette had ordered it removed entirely, and when the defense attorney tried to suggest he could have improvised some other solution, Dwayne answered flatly that there was no improvising a steel door, with a fire climbing the hill behind him. A structural engineer called by Ruth walked the jury through the physics of the delay, explaining how each additional minute allowed the fire's heat output to roughly double, meaning the difference between 9 minutes and 27 minutes wasn't a matter of inconvenience, it was the difference between a contained incident and a total loss. Finally, Ruth played a synchronized video built from the dashboard cameras of all 11 engines, timestamps ticking upward in one corner of the screen while the clubhouse burned in the other. At the 11-minute mark, flames reached the main roof. At 19 minutes, the western windows shattered outward. At 24 minutes, the propane tank began to overheat. At 27 minutes, the final engine finally crossed through. Ruth stopped the footage and told the jury plainly that the association hadn't lost its clubhouse because the fire department was too far away. They lost it because their own president wanted to collect $25 on a road that was never hers to charge for. Jurors deliberated for barely 3 hours, an unusually short span for a case of that size. And afterward, one juror told a local reporter waiting outside the courthouse that the video from the 11 engines had made the decision almost automatics, that watching the clock climb past 20 minutes while a building burned made every legal argument about intent feel beside the point. The jury found the association and Colette personally liable for gross negligence, awarding Silas compensation for road restoration, damaged equipment, forest losses, legal fees, and the ongoing risk created against his own property, a total judgment reaching $3,800,000. In a separate proceeding, the insurance company denied the majority of the clubhouse claim outright, citing the association's deliberate concealment of a known safety violation. With no insurance payout and mounting legal penalties, Cedar Summit's finances collapsed almost overnight, and Colette was forced out of the presidency entirely, with Brett and the remaining board voting to dissolve the old leadership structure altogether. The county prosecutor then formally charged Colette with obstructing emergency response, filing false safety documentation, and misusing community funds. And as she left the courthouse that day, she passed Silas in the hallway and told him had destroyed Cedar Summit. Silas answered simply that he hadn't destroyed anything. He had only tried to keep the road open, and she was the one who chose to lock it. 6 months after the fire, Cedar Summit's newly elected board signed a permanent agreement with both Silas and the county, keeping ownership of Redford Fire Access Road exactly where it had always belonged while formally protecting it, as an official emergency corridor. Under the new terms, no organization could ever install a gate or obstruction again. The county would help cover a share of maintenance costs. Fire crews would conduct regular inspections, and any future changes required sign-off from Silas, the fire department, and a county engineer, together with new signage along the route reading simply "Fire Access Never Block." The land where the checkpoint once stood was converted into a dedicated water refill point for fire engines funded using money recovered from the collapsed association reserve. Cedar Summit's new bylaws also required any future gate checkpoint or physical barrier on association property to pass an independent fire safety review before construction could even begin a rule. The board named informally the Redford Standard in honor of the man whose warnings had gone unheeded for far too long. The clubhouse was never rebuilt on that same hilltop. Ridgeview was instead converted into a defensible buffer zone, low vegetation only, with a proper turnaround wide enough for heavy apparatus. Silas used part of his settlement to repave sections of the road, reinforce the old bridge crossing, and build a small fire watch station on his own land, donating new radio equipment to the volunteer fire crew and purchasing a portable pump, capable of drawing water straight from his ranch reservoir. Rather than keeping the entire sum for himself, Abram placed a small plaque near the spot where the gate once stood, marking the date and the exact delay, 27 minutes and 14 seconds, with a simple line beneath it reading that control should never stand between rescue and fire. Colette accepted a plea deal to avoid a harsher sentence, receiving probation community service, in order to repay a portion of the misused funds and a lasting ban from holding any leadership position in a residential association again. Travis kept his contracting license after fully cooperating with investigators, though he paid a fine for failing to verify property ownership before building. Dwayne left association security altogether and eventually apologized to Silas directly, who didn't place the entire blame on him, but reminded him that following an order never erases responsibility when that order is clearly putting people in danger. Miriam became Cedar Summit's interim financial manager, opening the entire budget to public review and building safeguards so no future president could ever again fund an unauthorized project alone. The new board also invited Silas to speak at their first open community meeting, something Colette had never once done in her years as president, and he stood in front of a room full of residents who had once treated him as an obstacle and explained plainly what a defensible perimeter actually was, why brush clearance mattered more than decorative landscaping, and why every gate wall or checkpoint anyone ever wanted to build near a fire route needed to answer one question first: does this help a truck get through faster or slower? Nobody in that room argued with him. A year later, at the start of the next fire season, lightning struck the forest along Cedar Summit's western edge, and the alarm went out just before midnight. 11 fire engines rolled once again down Redford Fire Access Road, but this time there was no cabin, no rate sign, and no steel gate waiting for them. The convoy passed straight through Silas's land without slowing down at all, reaching the fire in under 9 minutes and containing it long before it could threaten a single home. Silas stood by the roadside at dawn, watching the engines return, one after another, dust rising gold in the early light, and counted them without meaning to all. 11, exactly the number that had once sat trapped and helpless behind a locked gate not far from where he now stood. Abram pulled up beside him and said the road had finally done exactly what it was always meant to do. Silas looked out at the empty stretch of dirt where the checkpoint had once stood, the ground still faintly scarred where the concrete anchors had been torn free, and answered quietly that the road had always done its job. It was people who had finally stopped standing in its way. Colette had built that gate to prove the association controlled everything within its reach. But when the fire finally came, that same gate proved something else entirely, that power without responsibility isn't strength at all. It's just a disaster waiting for its moment to arrive.